All right, I am live, but I don't know what happened to Daniel. Let me see. Hold on just a second. I know this is not good TV right now, but let me send him. Here he is. All right.
Literally the second we went live, my Chrome just shut down. That is sorry about that, everybody. But I'm here and I'm ready to go.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, I guess so first of all, people who have watched a bunch of these in the past will be happy to know that this looks like a day in which Daniel hasn't been mauled by his dog. So that's definitely an improvement. Uh, but when I was picking the title for this, was doing it a little playfully. So I think maybe we can dispense with the coup question really quickly and get to the fascism question. So I think if by coup you mean a soft coup, a lawfare coup, you're sort of the sense in which you might say the Bush v. Gore was a coup, then yeah, I think that in a incredibly half-assed and half-hearted sense, there is sort of an attempt at doing that right now. The most recent headline I saw about this, the New York Times this afternoon, was that in one of their court filings, they to try to prove voter fraud in Michigan.
They fucked up Michigan and Minnesota? Is that what?
Yeah, they've got
creeping fascism.
Yeah, they had data from Minnesota, so this is like a very well-oiled election stealing machine going on here.
A lot to be afraid of.
I believe Rudy Giuliani has also forgotten some judges' names, while he's been in court.
That dye must have seeped into his brain.
Yeah. Oh, this is not your coup A team. Like in Bush v. Gore, the Bush strategy was being plotted by James Baker, who was the Secretary of State before, and who knew everybody and everything, and was actually a pretty smart political operator.
Where Jeb Bush was governor in 30 years of Bush-dominated Republican politics. There's important contextual differences. And though
the fact that not only do they not have a James Baker, but everybody involved in the Trump effort right now seems to be one of the a comic relief minor character from season 3 of The Sopranos. Where you
had senescent septuagenarians. That is essentially what they are. And I do believe that they wanted to beat Bush v. Gore if there was an opportunity for it. I'm not denying that,
of course,
but it's just, and also it's interesting. I feel like people, I don't want to be misinterpreted by people thinking that I'm saying that the rule of law is going to operate here. I'm saying I think power is going to operate here, and that the Republican Party doesn't need, or to some degree even want, Trump any longer. And so I just think there's no will to power on any of the sides that really matter. And I don't think this is about the rule of law operating. I think this is about a more fundamental thing going on personally.
Yeah, so I think that there's maybe distinctions worth making, when you start thinking about the rule of law, because sometimes, I did a bonus episode a few weeks ago with Samuel Moyn about the Supreme Court.
Oh yeah, I know something.
Yeah, and he was very good on this, so people who think that we need to have really strong courts to override democratically passed laws, think that the courts are just going to be a vessel for what the law says, that they're somehow going to be outside of politics, even though literally all of our evidence says that they're not.
Yeah, in I don't know, Ben, ontologically speaking, well, you actually probably use that term too correctly. So let me move past that. From my perspective, I think law is not always, but oftentimes epiphenomenal of power.
Yeah.
Law. I mean, I guess I'm a vulgar Marxist in that sense. I really do believe that when looked at as a structure, law is epiphenomenal.
Yeah. So I think there's clearly a sense in which the rule of law isn't going to save us. The rule of law never saves us, because laws don't actually rule, people do. And I think that's correct. But I also think that the slightly complicating thing is that part of the strategy that people have to maintain power does involve at least a rhetorical reliance on certain legal rules. And so when they'll flout them or like just interpret them in ways that are just obviously going to be like, would like shock anybody, like, wait, what are you talking about? Right. Like, I think that there is like a limit to how much they're going to do that, at least depending on what's at stake in a given situation, because that would undermine like just on like a Gramsci sort of level, right? You know, that would undermine their like hegemonic strategy, right? You know, that like they need to have people think, you know, they need people to take, even if it's epiphenomenal, ultimately they need people to take this stuff seriously, because
particularly Democrats.
yeah. I mean, yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Right. So it's like, so the point of this is that the way the laws are is relevant, not because if they wanted it bad enough and like they really felt like they had a lot to gain and, you know, they weren't too worried about, you know, not that they wouldn't like find a way, right? I mean, lawyers and judges can always come up with some sort of convoluted explanation of how something they want to do fits the law. So it's not that they couldn't, it's that they won't, because they might have, if they were in a different sort of situation where like they had to contort a little bit less, right? Like they might have, done something, oh, what the hell? We'd rather have like Trump be president than Biden be president. You know, so like if they had to just contort a little bit, they might, right? Or if they had to contort just as much, but they thought they really had a lot to lose with the Biden presidency, then they might. But right now they would have to contort a lot. And by doing that, they would be, they don't have a lot to gain. They already got what they wanted from Trump. They've got their Supreme Court for a generation. They've got their, like they've everything that on their wish list, Trump more or less did. Right. So, so they don't have a lot to gain from keeping him around, and they are risking a lot because, you know, because if they did this at this point, on the basis of this little, I mean, then like you really might get a situation where like, you know, the next Democrat would like pack the court or, you know, whatever, like they really.
Well, the interesting thing, it would almost be interesting. I mean, obviously no one wants this, but it would be interesting for it to play out, because like, I wonder what the military would do.
Yeah, well, that's the thing too, right? You know, it's like, because like
militaries. I mean, like that is just like a fact. If you, I think it was Edward Lookback, who I don't really love, but book on coups, and I think he's like, in every single case, the military has to back the winning side. And so, I mean, this is
by definition, that's what a coup is.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yes. So it would just be interesting also to see on what level the military was what they were willing to do. You know, like just game that up.
Yeah, right. So like whether it's the idea of like a literal military coup, which I know now everybody will say, oh, nobody was saying that, but of course that's the beauty of these things, that like
people kind of were saying that. I mean, or at least
I mean, certainly half of my timeline was saying it. Like when Trump, you know, got rid of Esper as defense secretary, you know, that like I saw an awful lot of people saying, "Ooh, ominous signs," you know, and they'd like mention that along with like a bunch of like lawsuit stuff. So I think that, yeah. And I think that like somebody in the chat brings up the kind of lawfare coup that happened in Brazil when Dilma was removed and Lula was imprisoned, you know, on the basis of, you know, of a show trial essentially. But that one very much relied on the military being on their side.
Yeah, that was totally reliant on the military though. To get to get rid of Dilma and you know, related to the whole Lula thing,
pretty explicitly, I think. Actually,
and same in Bolivia. I mean, that was the military every single time, whether a gun is fired,
right?
The military has to express support for the one who is cooing effectively.
And I think some stuff has come out where the you know, the coup plotters and, you know, in Brazil, like obviously in Bolivia it was completely explicit, you know, that the military ordered Evo to leave. But like, I think some stuff has come out where the coup plotters in Brazil were like were, certainly at least behind the scenes, like, kind of like even bringing this up to judges, like, look, you don't do what we want you to do, right? Like we do have another option.
The military ruled, I think it's 64 to 85. I mean, like that's a country that's like a generation and a half outside of military dictatorship. So that, it's just a different situation,
Yeah. And the thing is, like, you start to imagine this in the US, and whether you go like the lawfare route through the Supreme Court or the fantasy of like a military coup, in either case, like the basic problem is the same, because like when I say things like this, people will say like, oh, so you think that Donald Trump, wouldn't do something undemocratic? It's like, no, of course I think that, right? Like, the question is not what Trump would do. I'm sure that he would love it if his Supreme Court justices and or the big beautiful generals bailed him out and let him stay president. I'm sure he'd be all for that.
And maybe he should have fired every fucking general in his administration. I mean, like the military is not a gigantic fan of Trump. At least,
No.
Who knows?
But there seems to be some evidence that the officer corps, it's not just that the enlisted people in the military. In fact, I think actually mostly went for Biden this time, but whatever. Like it's the
I think
certainly not like overwhelmingly for Trump in the way that he'd need them to. If he was hoping that they would follow him in this. But like I think the officer corps is not particularly friendly to Trump, like even and maybe especially on the upper levels. And even if they were, right, like the question is, like whether it's the judges or the generals, the question is what do they get out of it, right? Like and if like in the Supreme Court case, like precisely because we don't think that the law somehow autonomously exercises power, that's exactly why we should think, these guys are, like Megan Day said when I talked to her about this, these people are savvy political operators. They're very aware of how their decisions, impact the like institutional, credibility of the court. And frankly, they need to store that up for like 2025 or whatever, when they rule that like the minimum wage is unconstitutional, like it's, or whatever. It's probably not going to be that extreme, but like the point is like that they, like they have bigger fish to fry than whether this asshole who they probably don't even particularly like, because like, I mean, even if they've benefited from him to a certain extent, like, whether he gets to be president or not for the next 4 years. Meanwhile, right, they got their court majority. They have the, like, they're going to be very well positioned for 2024. Like, it just seems like whether it's the courts, whether it's the generals, whether it's the state legislatures, right, which would ultimately mean the courts anyway. Like, it just seems like I don't really understand what anybody thinks. Like, I understand why people think Donald Trump, if he could get away with it, would do it. Totally, right? But like, I don't understand why anybody thinks that all of the other actors that he would have to bring along with him to make this happen would go along with it.
Yeah. So Ben, I have theories. I have thoughts.
Okay, go for it.
So I think the two parties benefit from discussion of a coup for fundraising purposes. This is true of both parties. As Biden just tweeted some ridiculous thing asking.
Oh my God, he's got a Kickstarter for the transition. Yeah. Joe Means testing Biden has a begging cup out to fund his transition costs.
Cool move. So I think the discussion of coup is good for fundraising, and then I think it's also really important for sort of the mainstream and center left media as well. I mean, as people know, the New York Times was not doing particularly well before 2016. Neither was MSNBC or CNN. They were getting destroyed by Fox. So the Trump presidency has been an enormous boon for them. And I think discussion of a coup is them just sort of trying to wrest to use a biblical metaphor, the final drops of water from a rock, and so I think that's what's going in. And I don't know, maybe like I'm not always right. I know it's surprising to hear, but I don't know if you get the sense, but even on like the TL, people don't seem it's not like as passionate as about the Trump is fascism discussion,
Yeah. So
already seems like yesterday's news to me a little bit, as weird as that sounds.
No, I do want to, and I do want to transition to that in a second, but I think that's right. And I also think, I don't know that this is necessarily the reason exactly, but I think one thing that I find very frustrating about all the coup discourse is that it, like look, the election is over. What we would be like, certainly anybody, to the left of Biden, like what we would normally be transitioning to talking about now is Biden, right? Like, what's Biden going to do as president? What do his cabinet picks say? How should the left feel about that? And like every minute that we spend on fantasies about a coup is a minute that we don't spend talking about this god awful neoliberal administration that we're about to have.
How dare you? I'm a Biden bro. I it's just like so startling and wild when you think about that. This is who we wound up with at this particular historical moment. It's really depressing. And I don't know if you read Samantha Power's. We should probably do a different episode of this, but Samantha Power just released like the most pablum-filled, really saying nothing foreign affairs essay I've read in a long time, which is saying something. But yeah, no, it's a time for rebuilding. It's a time for, thinking through, we didn't win the primary and we should win it next time. But yeah, it's going to be a depressing moment.
Yeah, no, totally. Right. Like I, and I'm in a very awkwardly third way, place on all of this because I did, vote for Biden in my swing state, and I did encourage others to do likely, and I think there are reasons to, harm reduction and strategic reasons to do that. Although on the other hand, I also don't think Biden can be pushed to the left. I think that what you see is what you get, and I don't think Trump is a fascist. Which brings us to our main point, right? I think he's a Republican, which is bad enough, but I don't think he's a fascist because fascism actually has a historical meaning that's pretty specific and that's pretty different from anything that we're seeing in America today.
Yes. So before we get into this, I just want to make a clear point. So I think that some of our comrades got annoyed at me, and I think understandably in retrospect, because there is a genuine left-wing tradition in the United States that begins really gets going in the 60s and is associated particularly with elements of Black radicalism, but also the SDS and the New Left that did use the term fascist to essentially refer to the American carceral state and its institutions, the police, and what today, once someone would ICE is like the latest and most grotesque instantiation of that. And so I just want to just make clear that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about the fascism debate.
True. Although also, though, if you're going to say that there are, at least that there's something that's like, that there's some sense in which you can say like ICE, uses, like fascist tactics. So we we would know what somebody meant by that, right? That there's like this sort of, that like some of what ICE does seems very Gestapo-y. If like that's the point that somebody wants to make, something I've seen you point out, which I think is totally right, is that that point is actually undermined by all of the Trump is a fascist discourse because like individual colorful figureheads come and go, but like ICE existed when Obama was president, and it will exist when Biden is president, and some of the individual policies, change, but like the things that people are objecting to about institutions like that when they say they're fascist, right? Those are staying the same, and so when you talk about like Trump v. Biden as like the struggle against fascism, if anything, you're actually diverting from that issue.
Exactly. Yes, I would think so. So I just wanted to make clear that my objections to the use of the term are oriented and directed at a different tradition, and I would say a tradition that has had been more influential and much more pernicious. I don't think the other tradition is pernicious. Has been more influential and pernicious. So I just want to make that clear. And like when you just say something on Twitter, like I don't think Twitter is actually the space for essays and footnotes, but I just wanted to make that clear. That is not the tradition that I'm opposed to. That the left-wing radical use against the carceral elements of the state. I'm fine with that. But the tradition that I am referring to, and this is what I was really talking about, and what I've done some scholarly research on, if anyone is interested, it's an essay titled The Ghosts of Weimar, which explores how the deployment of the fascist analogy, the comparison of American political movements, political leaders to Hitler or to the Nazis has been deployed since 1945, I would argue, relatively consistently by people on the center and center left, who I would classify as the liberals, to essentially limit a number of things. So the first way it's used is in a most direct sense when people were analogizing the Soviet Union to Nazi Germany. And the justification of the Cold War, the justification for the creation of institutions like the CIA, the National Security Council, the DoD, were oftentimes made through the deployment of emergency powers, with the argument being that when you face an existential threat like Stalin, who is like Hitler, an existential threat, you're able to abrogate elements of democracy. And so this was one of many elements that were used to justify the creation of these types of emergency powers and emergency institutions. But the deployment of the fascist analogy was one of them, and a very powerful one. So what that suggests to me is that for one of the major elements of our current governance, these sort of secret institutions that, you know, their offspring were the surveillance state and all these, you know, the carceral state to some degree, even though that has other different origins, but they overlap. I think that it's an important strand of thought that creates modern American governance. So that's step one. And do you want to talk about that? Because then there's a step two I could talk about as well.
Yeah, why don't you do this step two, and then we'll circle back.
And then step two, building off this tradition, but departing from it in particular ways, is that whenever there have been mass movements in American history, for example, most famously during 1968, but also, you know, criticisms of the Black Panther Party and other sorts of, you know, really heterodox anti-state institutions or movements, they've also been compared to the Nazis in a way to limit political basically democratic politics, and to essentially centralize power in a technocratic, elitist, liberal state. So what I was worried about, and as I wrote about immediately after Trump was elected with my colleague Udi Greenberg, who wrote a great book titled The Weimar Century, who teaches at Dartmouth, we wrote an article essentially saying that one of the dangers of using the fascist analogy, particularly in an era where liberals are almost guaranteed to govern again, as they are right now, is that this could be used as a justification to further de-democratize politics. You know, and you saw that with the sort of the skepticism of populism, which came along with the critique of Trump as fascism, which to me reflected again this a liberal move toward expertise and elitism, which has deep roots in American history. But that's another story.
Yeah, as a very, very common, you know, reaction to the rise of Trump. I remember, like, in January 2017, I feel like I read about 20 articles that did these moves where they would, like, you know, to make the whole thing a little classier, they would, like, quote from, like, Plato about the dangers of democracy and how it can lead to the rise of strong men, and the word populism would be thrown around, and like this Trump shows that we have too much democracy critique was super common then. And it's also, of course, linked to this demonization of populism, which as like you know, Thomas Frank points out really well in his new book, the way that populism, like, one of the bizarre things about all this talk about populism is that it's somehow defined in a way that, like, doesn't at all fit the actual original populists who came up with the name. But that when they say populism is bad, they demonize populism, the move is to equivocate between your Trumps and Bolsonaros and Orbans, you know, your like right wingers with authoritarian impulses, and your Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyns, and, you know, like, because those are, yeah, we have populism with the right and we have populism with the left, sort of the same way that, you know, that people talked about totalitarianism in the 20th century, you know, that's, you know, fascism, communism, it's, you know, it's all the same stuff.
And it actually emerges in the same decade, the term totalitarianism, from the same source. And the great book on that is called The Lost Debate by William Jones. But I just wanted to make, and then step three for the fascism thing is that I also do think that the conditions of Okay, of Nazism in particular, which is what, in my opinion, most Americans think about when they hear the word fascism. There are complexities to the term fascism when we're speaking in a scholarly register between Italy, between Argentina, between Franco, between. It's not what I'm talking about. When I'm talking in the public sphere, I truly do believe most Americans think Nazism. And when you're comparing Trump or the Republican Party or the Proud Boys, or wasn't there like a Boogaloo Boys? That's another one.
Boogaloo Boys. Yeah, my it's like a stand-in joke in our house because my wife will read some like story about the Boogaloo Boys, like saying something crazy or doing something violent, and I'll always say if they want me to take them seriously, they need a better name.
True, but so if you're comparing even groups like that, or Nazi groups or white supremacist groups, which of course I'm Jewish, I understand that these are real things and they do have effects on the world. I'm not denying that. But when you compare the organizational structure, the numbers, and even the ability to enact plans to what the reality of, post World War I veterans without jobs in Weimar Germany, dealing with hyperinflation, dealing with a culture like steeped in all these revanchist myths, the stab in the back myth, this military glorification, where you have enough people to do things like form street gangs that could legitimately challenge a government. And you compare that to the Boogaloo Boys or today, I just don't think genuinely that there's much of a comparison. I think it's a totally different historical moment. And I think the despair of a post-World War I Germany just is not analogous to what was going on in the United States in 2015 and 2016. Not saying that we don't have despair. We have an incredible amount of despair, but the particular historical form that morphed into was just very, very different.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I want to pull back a little bit because I could see somebody like listening to this and the part of the problem is that anytime you're talking about these big, broad historical analogies where there are there are lots of different aspects of these things that if you're squinting at it at the right angle are going to be the same or going to be different, right? Because like no two situations are exactly the same, none are completely different, right? And of course I could see somebody say, oh, well, romanticization, stab to the back analogy, they'll come up with stuff, right, to link them up. And some of these things will be a stretch, but some of them like will make some sense or like there's something there. But I think maybe I'm being too much of an analytic philosophy nerd about this. But like I sort of want to step back and be like, okay, but like sort of definitionally, right? Like, what are we talking about? We're talking about fascism. And I think that one way you could answer that question is just like, well, that's a name of like a specific, set of movements that existed at a certain time in history and were at least allied to each other. So you can talk about Franco and Mussolini and Hitler. And in which case, like, it's just uninterestingly the case that doesn't exist now. But then we can like talk about how close an analogy it is, maybe, I guess, right? But I also think, and maybe this is where I'm being just, too much of my, my Trotskyist, underwear is showing over my, I don't know, like 2020, DSA Jacobin blue jeans, but like, but I mean, I have to say, like, when I think about fascism, a big part of what's influenced my thinking about this was reading Trotsky's writings on the rise of fascism in Germany in the 30s, or like even like other communist writers like Clara Zetkin a little bit earlier, like I think talking mostly about Mussolini.
Or Franz Neumann and Behemoth. I mean, a great sociological analysis of the rise to Nazi. Sorry, everyone, that's Vera the dog making noises. At least she's not beating me up today. But you have Franz Neumann, you have Zygmunt Neumann, you have Ernst Fraenkel, like a lot of Marxist stuff.
Yeah, right. So there are all these like classic Marxist writers who talk about fascism. And most of them have this like pretty specific idea about what it means. And, maybe we can nitpick it, but like, I think it's at least a useful starting point for thinking about it and for thinking about some of the respects in which, I mean, look, I mean, if all you're getting at is that like Trump and some of these other leaders, they're right wing and racist and nationalistic, and they do disgusting, horrible things and have authoritarian impulses, then yeah, obviously, let's just take all that as read, right?
Totally. I totally agree with that. There are very, very awful American traditions that produced Trump.
Yeah, but that's the key phrase, right? American traditions. That this is not like, like if you're sort of, if like in some ways, I think the problem with the fascism thing is almost the same as the problem with Russiagate, which is that you're trying to reach, say, oh, we got to explain Trump. We have to talk about something that's like very far away or a very long time ago. It's like, no, right? Like we can, like this is a rich and horrible uninterrupted American tradition, that we can talk about from like fucking whenever, right? Like,
so this is where some of my colleagues I could hear them saying in their minds, but there was an American fascist movement. So then I think some of this relies on
don't worry about the squeaking. Just
some of this relies on your peculiar historical reading of the 30s and the 40s. And I would say that ultimately, in my perspective, even though there was an American fascist movement that like literally aligned with Hitler, yeah. I think it was a minor political player ultimately. But I think that I just wanted to acknowledge that. But I think like Trump is much more coming not from the tradition of like the 30s and the 40s, the Madison Square Garden Nazi rally, but from tradition of like racist American plutocracy.
Yeah, like was Woodrow Wilson a fascist? Because if a lot of the things that people correctly, right, and rightly hate about Trump, right, are at least as true or much more true there, right? Like there was a like Trump,
yeah,
right. He jailed Eugene Debs, for being against World War I. He was openly aligned with the research.
He invaded fucking Veracruz.
Yeah.
And occupied Veracruz for 7 months, which very few Americans know about. He literally invaded and occupied Mexico.
Yeah. Yep. He did. And again, he was much friendlier to the KKK. Then and by the way, doing things they wanted, like resegregating the previously integrated, civil service. But he had a White House showing of Birth of a Nation, right? Like that's
born in the Reconstruction era South. I mean, like he had everything that implied.
Yeah. No, totally right. Or like, look, I mean, was William McKinley a fascist? Certainly a lot of the like very authoritarian stuff with like, fear mongering about anarchists and, look, if you want to compare, like some of what McKinley was doing to the left to like, as bad as it was to send the DHS to Portland to like rough people up and intimidate them, there's really no comparison there, all of which is not to say, oh, don't worry, Trump is fine because others have been worse, right? Of course, you shouldn't say that. Like all these things are alarming and you should be against them.
Also, Ben, I think it's important to highlight with McKinley, he conquered the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and
which is a big element of historical fascism that like it's always been bound up with militarism.
We could get into our own peculiar checklist with fascism, right? And then I think at some point these discussions do come somewhat down to which particular elements you think are central to fascism.
Yeah, so let me just really quickly, because I alluded to it earlier, right? But like the sort of Trotsky, Claire Zetkin, all those, right, like Marxist writers in the 20s and 30s who were writing about fascism, like what their idea of it was, right? So their idea of fascism, which certainly at least is a tight fit for the historical canonical models. We can then have like a more complicated discussion, like somebody in the chat brought up like Pinochet, right? Like, okay, that's certainly a right-wing authoritarian dictatorship. Is that fascism? What does that mean, right? Fair enough. But before getting into the gray cases, right, let's just talk about the clear cases. The clear cases, by which we mostly mean like Mussolini and Hitler, right? Like those are the main cases, people are thinking of when they think of historical fascism. So what we're talking about are things that start out as street fighting mass movements that exist with the goal of like physically smashing the socialist and communist left and the workers' movement, and that then
democratic, like literally believe democracy is not a viable political form.
Yeah, and once they take power, what they do is they use those street fighting mass movements. They incorporate them into or use them to partially supplant the traditional machinery of the state and completely end parliamentary democracy and use the state enhanced by your black shirts, brown shirts, SS, all those kinds of forces to physically eliminate the left, and then depending on which specific fascists we're talking about, other groups also, so like Jews, certainly in Germany, obviously, other minorities,
Serbs, Jews, Roma, especially Slavs in the case of the Nazis. And it's also tied to an expansionist political program. I mean, particularly in the Nazi case, but also in Italy, linked to foreign conquest, literal foreign conquest. You have Mussolini in Ethiopia, and then you have, of course, Hitler and throughout Central Europe.
Yeah, it is inept as the Italian fascists were at foreign conquest. Like they did keep trying, right? Like it's a
central element to it. I mean, and then also allied with Hitler. Like there was going to be if Hitler had succeeded in gaining Lebensraum, Mussolini would have had a serious role to play in the occupation of those colonial territories. That wouldn't have been a joke. And so. While I do think that Trump is clearly tied to elements of American militarism, and he is a militarist and he valorizes those things, there's just no equivalent to that. I mean,
look, we can bring it back to the coup alarmism we started with, because, in fact, one of the main things that was being used to promote alarmism, not just about a soft or lawfare coup of the kind they're so ineptly and half-heartedly trying to do right now, but like a real, serious, literal military coup, was Esper, being dumped as Secretary of Defense and Trump installing loyalists at the Pentagon. But if you actually dig into what happened there, right, like apparently, right, the reports, CNN and stuff say that a big part of the Trump Esper thing was about Trump wanting to draw down troop levels in Afghanistan, which Esper, thought was premature, which is awesome, because we're literally talking about a war that's been going on for so long that there are people who were not born. Yeah, that there are people who are fighting in Afghanistan today who were not born when 9/11 happened.
This is actually something that I've never heard people really discuss because it's really distasteful. But I'll just put it this way, and I don't mean this in any sort of praise way. But Hitler was very able to manipulate the organs of the German state in a very, very effective way. He was able to purge the army. He was able to even purge the Sturmabteilung, the SA, his own brown shirts, in order to align with the power holders of German society at the time, right? He got the Prussians on his side. He got the industrialists on his side. He got the military on his side. He got everyone on his side. In a way that was like very canny and very successful. And it's just Trump, I didn't think he was ever going to be able to do it. And I think I was proven right. Trump did not prove adept in any way whatsoever at getting the American state behind him, because I don't think he's ideological. I mean, he's broadly ideological, but he's not, you know what I mean, right? He's not like motivated by a particular political program that he's going.
It's pure self-aggrandizement.
And sort of like strange urges that come from nowhere. And it's just like, I mean, there were elements of Hitler like that. I'm not denying that, but it's just like the character of the leader is so different between Trump and a Hitler. It's literally.
No, it is, and it's also not just a question of character, because it's also, this gets down to the difference between somebody who is a fascist in the sense that not just that they like use rhetoric that might be, resonant to fascism, or, that they have some authoritarian impulses. is a fascist in the sense that they are the leader of a fascist mass street movement that then takes state power, overthrows parliamentary democracy, and physically smashes, the workers' movement, and in the most canonical case, then commits genocide. But the difference between those is important here because, like, Trump has to rely on the existing institutions of the state, a lot of which are dominated by people who can't stand him, and want to obstruct him, when possible. And this is like not like, if you actually go back and look at it, right? Like, what are the scariest things about Trump? Well, Muslim ban, family separation. Moo, thank you for the super chat. Says Daniel's coffee cup equals fire. I got him as plates. So I don't actually see the coffee. Oh, okay, gotcha. So they have like Muslim ban, family separation, building the wall, generally doing like terrifying, anti-immigrant stuff. And the thing and then like, you can talk about some of the stuff like sending, the DHS to Portland, or you can talk about doing, like when he was like dropping these like bizarre little trial balloons on Twitter about how like maybe we can't have an election at all because of COVID. Like, and the thing in almost every single one of those cases is that he didn't actually get away with any of that shit. Like there's no wall. There's literally no like they did a little bit of repairing and rebuilding of already existing fencing along the border, but they didn't fence anything that wasn't already fenced. So there's no wall. Family separation, after everybody was rightly horrified by it, they backed off of. The Muslim ban was the most successful one because after watering it down a few times and, having, because various courts told them they couldn't do it, in the forms that existed, like they found a watered down and disguised enough version they were able to keep. But other than that, I mean, look, the most like striking thing is that Trump succeeded in. It's not a question of what he tried to do, right? Like, he tried to do horrible shit when it comes to immigration, but he succeeded in deporting fewer people than Obama did. And we can talk about how much of that is because of Trump specifically freaking people out enough to find innovative ways to resist the deportation machine, which is a good thing. And we can talk about how much of it is a result of efforts by immigrants' rights activists that have been ongoing since the Obama administration to do things like, sanctuary cities, et cetera, right? Like, whatever you make of the, whatever you make of the causes of that, right? The fact is that he didn't succeed in that, which really speaks to like how mind-bogglingly weak a presidency this is, right?
And I think I just want to make clear, obviously, everything that Ben just mentioned, we are against, but we think it's more of a continuation than a rupture, ultimately. I think that's the ultimate claim that we're making, that the horrible elements of Trump were continuations of previous policies or were clearly able to be tied to particular American movements and structures. So we're saying it's all horrible, but I think the important thing when we're talking about fascism is that I really do think it implicitly others him. And I think that's the exact wrong political message to take. And I think that's a political message, at least implicitly, that the Never Trumpers were advocating, that the Democratic Party was advocating, that many people who were philosophically liberal were advocating. And so I think that's why it's so crucial, because I think it's important, and I may be wrong or proven wrong as time goes on, to be aware of how like the language is used in public discourse. And this is why I think that I attacked the fascist analogy so vociferously, even though I think I could have been like a bit more intellectually supple on like at least acknowledging those other traditions in which it was used.
Yeah, no, for sure. Like, and so I think, we could like juggle a couple of different things that are all true here. One of which is that Trump really did do various things to escalate horrible things that already existed in U.S. institutions and make them worse. Right, like that's true. But also true is that if you if you focus solely on the escalation, or you focus on it in a way that like makes that the main issue, like, okay, you're applying this label fascism to like put all of our attention right on the differences between Trump and the Democrats, basically, right, is what we're talking about. Although there's also an interesting question about the difference between Trump and other Republicans, because part of the effect of the fascism discourse is also to obscure that, right? Because really, I think when it comes to the most successful, horrible things that Trump did, I think that honestly, most of the successful horrible things that Trump did were horrible things that Mitt Romney would have done as president, because they're just like Republican things, like appointing hardcore union busters to the National Labor Relations Board, and and like reversing a bunch of precedents in order to make it harder to organize unions. Those are things that's what Trump did, but it's 100% for sure what Romney would have done too, or McCain would have done. And so if you want to focus at the very least, right, and like this is also a reason why some of the like never Trump types like the fascism discourse, right, that like it really obscures that. But like also if you want to focus on, hey, what is it that yes, like this deportation machine is terrible and evil and needs to be resisted, but if you're focusing on Trump as an aberration from the American norm, which is like realistically the main rhetorical effect of the fascism discourse, then you're actually, in a way, you're letting that deportation machine off the hook, right? Because instead of talking about how horrible and crushing of human hopes and dreams and violent and repressive that is, right, you're talking specifically, and like you're really obscuring everything except for how Donald Trump is using it. And I mean, this almost feels simplistic, but like there's really a lot of truth to it. Like the reason why this matters, right? Maybe because like we got to end in the next couple of minutes. Actually have to jump on another live stream at Jacobin. But the, I think something that some people might be wondering right now is like, okay, maybe all this is true, but come on, isn't this just kind of pedantic and like, is this like just ever like, is this just like a couple of like asshole academic dirtbag leftists sitting around saying, it's like, well, technically, technically to be a champagne, it has to come from the Champagne region of France. I don't think it is, right? Well, I lost Daniel at a key point here. With any luck, he'll come right back on. But whether he does or not, right? If Daniel's connection is gone again, I do want to just kind of wrap up with this, right? Like, why is it that this matters, right? What is okay? So Daniel's internet died. He's going to try to sign back on with his phone, but let me just wrap up like this. So I think that the reason that this matters, the reason that this is not just a matter of being pedantic about history and definitions and missing the point, is because the Trump as a fascist stuff is very intimately tied. Oh, here we go. Perfect. So
about that, my internet is dead. But Ben, I think I actually I was able to hear you for most of it. So do you mind?
Okay, yeah. So what I was starting to say, right, is just this, right? The reason why all of this is actually significant, right? The reason why we've been talking about this for the last hour, and that this is not just sort of like finicky, like nitpicking because like, we're annoyed by liberals and, whatever, even if that's maybe part of it, is that there is actually something at stake here, right? Like the thing that's politically at stake here is that the effect of fascism talk is to do two things, right? One is it's to blunt, left critique of liberalism as like sort of a distraction to like the all-consuming, all-important, struggle against fascism. And the second is that it really is, like, at the risk of sounding simplistic, like it really is very intimately tied to the great, once Biden's president, right? Like we could spend another 2 months like sweating about, the Trump, Trump coup stuff. But like once Biden's president, we can all go back to brunch, right? Like it really is tied to that, right? Like are you primarily framing Trump as a continuation and as a personally colorful but basically natural expression of things that have existed long before him and are an integral part of the American political system? Or are you basically framing Trump as an aberration from that system? And I think how you answer that is going to tell us a lot about what you think now that Biden's going to be president. And I think that's what's actually at stake.
I think that's right. So I'm just curious what you think, not just to play devil's advocate, because I'm trying to think what were the strongest. I think the strongest criticisms were, one, that there was this left-wing tradition, and then two, some people said that the fascism discourse actually mobilized people to challenge Trump. I think those were the two ones that I found the most compelling. I don't agree. I think like maybe you could even argue the fascism analogy actually limited the political possibility, given that we wound up with Biden and not Bernie. I mean, I'm not sure how directly those are related, but they might be related.
I think it is pretty related, because I think that a lot of the case, like, look, why did people vote for Biden? We know for a fact that it's not because they agreed with him and disagree with Bernie about policy, because we have exit polling data from every Super Tuesday state that tells us otherwise.
Right.
The reason they voted for Biden was that they thought that Bernie was too much of a gamble, and that Biden, was a safe bet for beating Trump. Which I thought then, and I think now, is misguided in certain ways. I think if COVID hadn't happened, I think there's a real good chance that Trump would have won. But in any case, I actually do need to jet. So in like 3 minutes, I'm going to go on the Jacobin YouTube channel. I'm going to be talking to our friend and comrade Bhaskar Sunkara about how a fully socialist society that avoided the problems of the Soviet model might actually work. If people
before we go, I just want to say, cool use of the word jet. I haven't heard that in a while.
I'm very old, Daniel.
I will smell you later.
Fair enough. All right. I really appreciate it as always. Just like if this relationship with Vera has become abusive, you have options. I hope you know that.
Yeah, I mean, she actually does do a number on me, but I think it's all in fun. So.
All right, fair enough.
All right,
thanks,
and bye, people, for watching.
All right, thanks, guys. Heading over to Jacobin. Left is best.